All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're pleased to welcome you to the fifth session of Democracy and Disagreement. Just to recap, I'm Deborah Satz, and along with Paul Brest, I'm the faculty lead for this class, and Graham Ambrose is the TA. Each of our 10 classes addresses a contemporary issue of policy about which people hold strong, differing views. Each class has two immediate goals: to illuminate the issues and to do so by modeling the critical, empirically informed, respectful conversations that lie at the core of the university's mission, the pursuit of knowledge. We also hope in this course to shed light on why some degree of disagreement is an inevitable feature of a democratic society. Only dictatorships produce an outward appearance of conformity and unanimity on a wide range of issues. Yet, while disagreement is a feature and not a bug of democracy, it's hard. And it's especially hard when the stakes of the disagreement are high. The first part of today's class is devoted to such a difficult and high-stakes issue. Today, on the topic of the possibility of a two-state solution or any solution for Israel and Palestine. This question has generated deep and passionate disagreement like few other issues explored in this course. Our aim today is not to resolve the issue, but to begin to understand the disputed facts and values that underlie it, to better inform our own understanding and perhaps give guidance to solutions. During the second part of this class, students and others will have the chance to ask questions and make comments, not speeches, but comments of the sort that are appropriate to furthering discussion. Of course, if you hear something this afternoon about which you disagree, you're allowed, in fact, you're encouraged to ask hard questions of our speakers during the question and answer. We recognize that engaging in respectful conversation is only one mode of bringing one's case to one's fellows. Protest and organizing are also legitimate means of engagement, although subject to time and place restrictions. For anyone who feels motivated to protest the class or particular speakers or to make a long speech, there's a free speech zone outside the class for doing so. So, encourage you, there are many modes of engagement here. We're focused on reason giving and evidence and dialogue. Before I introduce today's topic and speakers, if you're a student enrolled in the course, could you scan the QR code on the screen and fill out the Google form for attendance? So this is only for the enrolled students. Thank you for doing that. Okay, so our topic today is the possibility of a two-state solution or any solution for Israel and Palestine. We don't need to tell anyone in this room what's at stake here. We're very fortunate to have two knowledgeable and distinguished participants, as well as a knowledgeable and distinguished guest moderator to help us in this endeavor. Salam Fayyad is an economist who served as the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority from 2007 to 2013. He began his career with the International Monetary Fund, including serving as the IMF's resident representative in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. He also served as manager of the Arab Bank in Palestine and as Minister of Finance of the Palestinian Authority. Dr. Fayyad holds a BSc from the American University of Beirut, an MBA from St. Edward's University, and a PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin. He's a senior visiting scholar at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and has had appointments at many other institutions, including the Brookings Institute and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Alon Tal is a visiting fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. His research involves a broad range of issues concerning public policy and sustainability, primarily considering the effect of rapidly growing populations on natural resources and the environments. He's held appointments at Harvard, the Stanford Business School, Ben-Gurion University, Tel Aviv University, and Hebrew University, among other institutions. He's also an environmental activist and politician, having worked in government as a member of the Knesset and founded several environmental organizations in Israel. He holds degrees from the University of North Carolina, from Hebrew University, and from the Harvard University School of Public Health. He also has played the saxophone and fiddle in the Jerusalem-based rock band Liquid Plumber. Our moderator today is Larry Diamond, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also professor by courtesy of political science and sociology at Stanford. He formerly directed FSI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and now heads its program on Arab reform and democracy. His research focuses on democratic trends and conditions around the world, and on policies and reforms to defend and advance democracy. His latest book is Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. He served as a consultant to various institutions, including as a senior advisor on governance to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. We imagine that the speakers will converse for about 45, 50 minutes, and then the floor will be open for questions or comments from the audience. To allow as much participation as possible, please keep your questions or comments relatively brief. We're also going to survey the audience at the beginning and the end of each class to see whether arguments move minds. That said, even when minds are not moved, we hope the class gives you an appreciation for the reasoning behind views you hold, as well as views that you reject. So here's the two-part question that we're posing today. Part one, if a two-state solution involving Israel and Palestine is possible, would you support it? And two, do you think there remains a reasonable possibility for such a two-state solution? So please, if you could fill out the poll, and we should have this in a moment in real time. And then I will hand it over to Larry to kick off the discussion.
You going to tell me what the results are? Or?
We'll have to look up like that. Let's see.
Well, while you're waiting for the results, let me just say a couple of preliminary things. Do you have a result?
Yeah, I can't quite see the numbers. I think I have to go up here to see the numbers. My eyesight is terrible. Somebody else better read this. Paul.
Okay, well, eventually we'll get a result. It's not a result that's going to probably remain exactly the same. Let me say, first of all, what an honor it is, Deborah and Paul, to be invited to join you today. Thank you for the invitation, and most of all, thank you for putting forward this issue to your class on democracy and disagreement and enabling a number of other students and people in the community to join.
While you take a break, let me just tell you that 55% answered yes, they would support the two-state solution, or they think it's possible, and 39% no, they don't think it's possible. Is that right? Do I have it backwards? Backwards. And then the number of people who polled on the second question is so small, I'm not sure we can draw a conclusion.
Okay. So with that, here we go. I just want to say a personal word. I've gotten to know Alon Tal over a number of months now, as he's been here since January as a visiting professor. And I've gotten to know Dr. Salam Fayyad over the last 2 days. And It's a great honor to be with the two of you. And I will say also what I repeatedly hear from people in the United States who've tried to participate in the negotiation of and support the negotiation of some kind of peaceful resolution of this conflict. People like Dennis Ross, people like someone you worked with, Salam Condi Rice, they meet people like the two of you and they have to believe it's possible. So we'll see if the audience has the same attitude at the end. I'd like to begin by asking you essentially the first question. What do you think, if this conflict can ever be resolved, what do you think is the right solution or the best solution for peace and justice in Israel-Palestine? Is it one state? Is it two states? Is it something we haven't thought of? Salam, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Larry, very much, and thank you, Deborah, for the introduction. Paul, I'm happy to share the floor with Alon on this important issue. Very much appreciate the opportunity of having visited yesterday and today with students. Had a talk yesterday about similar issues, so forgive me if some of you attended yesterday's event for having heard the story before. I was interested in the initial results on where people stand on the questions raised. Thinking maybe in the way I answer questions should be kind of in some way take into account how people feel about this. Very much interested in how they feel afterwards. But I did not come to this class, which is clearly a very welcome innovation, and I congratulate you on having conceived the idea of doing this. Would love to see more of this on campuses around the country and the world. Very important part of learning, which is essentially what these institutions are about in the end. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this, what I believe to be a very important opportunity. On the fundamental question that you raised, type of solution, and if a two-state solution is possible, if I may, without taking too much time on this, you mentioned something about interlocutors, mediators, those who for a long time have thought that, well, this is within reach, with certain landmarks along the way that made that thought plausible, as a matter of fact, particularly after the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. There are many, I think, with good reasons at the time, who thought that on the strength of goodwill generated by that landmark handshake on the White House lawn, it was September 13th, 1993, that process was going to be smooth sailing, notwithstanding, the ambiguity and structural problems associated with the agreement, a part of which was signed that day, some of it was elaborated later, which was harbinger of the difficulties that some people foresaw at the time of signing, that there were issues that could not be resolved at the time. And those issues that could not be resolved at the time and difficulty encountered at the time and conceived of as issues that could not be resolved to make a two-state solution possible immediately, told the whole story. Those were the difficult issues then, and they remained the difficult issues throughout the process that was supposed to presume to culminate in the emergence of a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. Although some of you may not know that actually none of the language that I have just used was in the documents itself, in the agreement. None of it, actually. There was not even the suggestion of Palestinian sovereignty over even a square inch of the landmass that is historical Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, etc. None of it. Some said at the time that the mention of borders as one of those issues deferred for agreement until a later date, no later than 5 years after the conclusion of Oslo Accords, was an indication that what we're really talking about is a border. But that was too technical in some way, because borders can be political borders, but they can also be custom borders, and they can be borders between states like United States of America, for example. But that's the closest anyone could have gotten, based on text, to the notion that this may be about Palestinian state. Problem. I recently was asked to guest speak. One of my colleagues at Princeton, it's not something I teach, by the way, we were just having this conversation before, but I do guest speak on it. And the course was interesting about perceptions, the role perceptions have played in what everybody agreed was complete derailment and progressive widening of what I personally call the expectations gap. And that I define as the gap between what we Palestinians would consider to be basic minimum acceptable and what the Israelis at some point or another would have considered as the maximum they could offer. My own perception is that that gap has been widening, particularly after the turn of the century, and progressively so, to the point where many kind of really started to lose faith, and progressively so, in the possibility, the word possibility. Even if that was considered to be a most reasonable way to go about it, and the thought that it might have been reasonable goes back to the 30s of last century, before the partition plan of 1947. So even for those who believe that that's the best way out is to partition the land, somehow started to actually progressively disconnect from it on grounds of lack of viability, impossibility. And what they had in mind basically was the settlement expansion, growth settler population, and the rest of it. Given Israel's own view of the nature of itself as a state, home for dominantly Jewish people, etc., and the reality of a good chunk of Israeli population moving to live, reside in the territories occupied in Israel by Israel in 1967, the very territory on which that state of Palestine was going to emerge. Back to the perceptions and the genesis of this gap that I'm talking about. For Palestinians, even though I was not party to the scene at the time, not even remotely, I was a civil servant internationally at the time, just reading about what was going on, surprised by what happened in Oslo, as anyone, actually, we all were focused on what was happening in Madrid or in connection with the Madrid Peace Conference that took place in 1991. But then all of a sudden, this thing happened. Negotiations were secret, and there was this agreement, declaration principles. Maybe he will cover some of that ground. But I can tell you, based on everything I learned subsequently, now my own reaction to it, how at the time in the United States, working for the IMF in the DC area, when I heard about it, I presumed for sure this was going to be, perception-wise, about a Palestinian state on the territory Israel occupied in 1967, all of it. That was the presumption. And it appears as though that was the working assumption of our leadership that signed on to that agreement. I do not, and I got to know all of them subsequently and deal with all of them. I didn't really get the sense at all that they had harbored any doubt about that outcome being buttoned out. Not a Palestinian state only, but a Palestinian state on all of the territory occupied in 1967. That's the perception. Now, on the Israeli side, it is clear to me, analytically speaking, going through the record and having to talk to some of the principals on the Israeli side who had done this, including members of the negotiating team originally, that actually the marching orders were to the delegation before the final conclusion of the declaration of principle, make the state a possible outcome, but not necessarily the outcome. When you look at it this way, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the agreement had this ambiguity, and it was supposed to culminate not in Palestinian statehood, but was supposed to culminate in agreement on so-called permanent status issues. Those very issues, borders, refugees, water, security, that kind of, Jerusalem, of course. Those were supposed to be negotiated, and the negotiation was supposed to end in May of 1993. Nothing about statehood. And I think that was a key factor in what happened subsequently. Disillusionment. And then there was violence in the 90s that contributed to the gap beginning to widen, and then post-2000, the eruption of the Second Intifada, years of violence and all of that, did a lot, in fact, to drive people away from thinking that that is really likely anytime soon. Hope was resuscitated again in the context of what became known as the Annapolis process, because there was an important round of negotiations after that that did not really produce, and then there was another last round of negotiations on this, led by Secretary John Kerry, beginning in 2013. Those didn't last too long. It had a short timeline, ended without agreement, and we are where we are. Majority on both sides, do not now subscribe to the idea that a solution like this is possible. Let me just close, and so I would give an opportunity for some interaction on this, by saying the following, and to be direct in answering the question, what do I think, whether it's desirable or not desirable, what the alternatives may be, and again, what is possible. The answers to this, when you listen to people talk about this, are related fundamentally to their own assessment, that given where we are now, given what we know about the history, it is most unlikely that there's going to be convergence, enough of it, to the point where that state of Palestine can happen in a manner that Israel can live with, in a manner that's acceptable to Palestinians, responsive to national aspirations, needs, and all of that. And that is really not surprising. But my point is this. If in fact that is really a desired or the most realistic solution to this problem, I don't think it needs to be judged, not that I really believe it can be judged in a reasonable way, based on where we are today and based on what happened in the past. Because, and I have to be very honest with you, even if that solution is still viable, it's not around the corner. I like to believe it still, because there are some who will tell you it's dead, it's deader than dead, it has been dead forever. I myself was quoted more than once having said, and I did say, it's on life support. And that goes back many years, to be honest with you. So, but where I am today is, when it happens, when that happens, by definition, that would be a moment of convergence. What it is that people would converge on at the time would be that people living the moment would converge on. And I would not want, where we are in terms of difficulty right now, of seeing that as a possibility to really get in the way of people figuring it out. Finally, therefore, if this is really the way out, and again, as a concept, it goes back to the 30s of last century, in ways formally in 1947 and all, and subsequently the history is known, we'll skip over that. I don't think it really, given the failures of the past, just because of how we feel about things, given the experience, we should say it's impossible forever. People look at certain aspects, settlements in particular, and they say, how can it possibly be resolved along the lines of two states if given the massive expansion in settlements and settler population in the West Bank now, it was in Gaza for some time as well. I do not know how these issues are going to be seen by people at the time when that convergence will happen. I like to believe that convergence will happen at some point. I just don't see it as sustainable for a conflict of this nature to keep going on forever. I know that some people have gotten to that conclusion. And I would not really want to ever, argue the case on the basis of what is bad about all other alternatives, because there is, in the discourse, importantly, the idea, why not one state for everybody? And by the way, that was the position of the contemporary Palestinian national movement. The position of the contemporary Palestinian national movement, going back to 60s of last century, was one state, one secular state for everybody, et cetera, et cetera. But then the PLO, which adopted that platform, started to shift in the mid-70s in the direction of accepting two-state solution. But most formally in 1988, when they actually resolved and declared essentially willingness to accept as a solution a state on the territories that are occupied in 1967. So that it has been there. So people who say like one state is the answer, if it can be a solution, what we're living right now is not a one-state solution. What we're living is a one-state reality with all the negatives associated with it not being a solution. Reality is reality, but is it a solution? Is it sustainable in any way? Can we really ever, as a people, I'm speaking, as a Palestinian, can we ever kind of experience living as free people with a sense of dignity and being included as equals in a country of our own, right, which is not denied to any other people or nation anywhere in the world today, anyway, basically. And I don't think that is what we see right now. And more of what is happening as a reality like this, I don't think is going to really take us there for a variety of reasons. I'll be happy to engage in a conversation on this, but that's where we are now. The case for two states is not the case against the alternatives. But if it is to really be framed in this way, I would like for it to really be viewed against the backdrop of the reality of one state, not the solution. That's one state. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Salam. So we have on the table both some reflections on what might and might not be desirable, some reflections on the history of how we failed, and obviously a lot of the obstacles. So why don't you begin with what you think is most desirable given the circumstances, and if you have any thoughts on the history, you can reply on that too, and then we'll come back to the present and the future.
Well, thanks, Larry, and Deborah and Paul, thank you for coming, and particularly to Dr. Fayyad. It's a pleasure to exchange ideas. Before I refer to the question, I'd like to make two personal preliminary comments. And the first one is directly to you. Almost immediately after October 7th, you wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where you immediately called for the release of the Israeli hostages in Gaza. I thought that was an incredibly courageous thing to do. It was a unique voice in the Palestinian community. I wanted to thank you, how much it meant to me to have you do that. The second comment is this. All over the world today is the final day of celebrating the Jewish festival of Passover. This is when we celebrate the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, presumably by the parting of the Red Sea, which allowed the Israelites to leave. And there's a famous legend, which we say almost every year at our Seder, where the angels, when they see the Israelites leaving, start to sing joyously. And they're chastised by God, who says, "How dare you sing when my creatures are dying?" Okay? And I raise this issue because I think it's a very important part of Jewish heritage and values to say that there should be no ever celebration at the suffering of enemies. And I am acutely aware of the incredible tragedy of the last 7 months in Gaza, the deaths, the suffering, the injuries, and I'm regretful of it. I'm very hopeful that discussions like this can put us in a place where we won't have to repeat these kind of horrible experiences. Now, with regard to the question of a two-state solution, I'd like to share how I think the debate, which has been completely polarizing in Israel over the last 20, 30 years on this question, divides. And you could sort of split it into two camps. One I'm going to call the 1948 camp and the 1967 camp. And you'll understand the chronological order and why that matters. So in 1948, in May, Israel declares independence and immediately is attacked by 6 countries as well as the indigenous Arab Palestinian residents of the land. Miraculously, 600,000 Jews who were there managed to not only survive but do fairly well in terms of the outcome of the war. But subsequent to that, the position of the entire Arab world is that Israel is a sin, is a flaw, is something that needs to be liquidated. And so a litany of wars trying to push Israel into the sea or wipe it off the mat ensued. And indeed, it's all culminated in the famous 1967 August declaration in Khartoum, the 3 no's of the entire Arab League: no to negotiations, no to Israeli states, no to peace, et cetera, et cetera. This changed dramatically in 1977 when Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem, declared his willingness to make peace. But what's important was when he did make this peace agreement, he did it on the basis of the 1967 borders. He said, let's turn the clock back. I want to get back the Sinai Peninsula. Israel had increased its border size almost by 300% after the 1967 war, and Israel made that territorial concession, and I think the results are not perfect, but from an Israeli perspective, satisfactory. We have peace with Egypt. And that was the perspective on the Jordanians when they made a peace treaty with us. So the question which we have been facing in Israel is, when the Palestinians come to make peace with us, are they talking about 1967 and a willingness to live within the borders of the West Bank? Or are they really talking still about 1948, that ultimately they don't accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state in the Middle East? Now, with regard to Dr. Fayyad, his position I think has been clear historically. I have no problem. I think he's very clear in terms of where the borders need to be or whatever. But the problem is that October 7th changed a lot of that for Israelis. In October 7th, we saw, after leaving the Gaza Strip, handing the keys to the Palestinian Authority in 2005, how after almost 2 decades of a litany of and endless attacks, a bombing, whatever, we saw the most barbarous attack that we've ever taken. And the thing is that not only was that the worst day in terms of Jewish history since the Holocaust, it was the worst day, I think, in the history of Palestinian national aspirations, because Israelis became extremely skeptical about it. We realized, many of us, like myself in the peace camp, over the years had hoped that Hamas, which enjoys broad support now, greater than ever in the West Bank and in Gaza, was never really, they were being, how should I put it, providing lip service when they went to these extremes. We were aware of their charter, which is extremely anti-Semitic, which calls for murdering Jews. I think Section 7 even goes about it poetically, where the rocks call to Muslims, come and murder the Jews that are hiding behind me. But we figured, when the actual challenges of running a country, in Gaza essentially a small, but was definitely run like a country, when that happens, they have to fix the potholes and run an education system and a health system, they'll eventually get pragmatic and learn to live with us. And that conception was shattered on October 7th for many of us, including myself. Now, some people say, well, maybe you should get over it and go beyond that. And I can understand people compare it often to 9/11. But the truth of the matter is that although this is comparable to 9/11, a terrorist organization attacks a state, there are some fundamental differences which I want to point out. The first, of course, is dimensions. I think probably about 20 times more Israelis were killed. The second is the proximity. This would be comparable to, say, thousands of Mexicans crossing the border or people crossing the George Washington Bridge to the Twin Towers. There was the intimacy of it, the fact that thousands of people came over the border high on, Captagon, amphetamine, which increases violence and aggression, and it burned people alive, disemboweled them, raped women. There was something about it, the cruelty, and with the glee with which it was broadcast back, that was deeply, deeply disturbing. And then, of course, the subsequent celebration and the declaration of Hamas leaders were going to do it again and again and again, which they did without any hesitation. So naturally, Israelis are very, very concerned about that. Now, I open with all of that because in spite of that, I recognize that a two-state solution is an existential need for the state of Israel. It's also an existential threat to the state of Israel, as I've described, because we've seen the intentions. But I don't see any way in the long term that I can look my grandchildren when they finally come in the eye and say, we have a life here that is sustainable. Now, I have a reason to be optimistic, because today is different than any other time in the history of the region for the following reason. The vast majority of Arabs in the Middle East live in countries with diplomatic relations with Israel. And this was tested on October 21st in Cairo, when there was a so-called peace summit or some sort of a summit there, and the more extremist elements in the Arab world demanded, once again, to return to the nose of Khartoum, cancel Israeli access to your airspace, cancel diplomatic relations, and these kind of things. And the Sunni and largely moderate countries said no. They pushed back. In fact, there wasn't even a statement released after that gathering. And we saw it tested again just this month on April 13th, when the Iranians started sending their hundreds of drones and missiles and et cetera to Israel, and Jordan helped very actively in taking them down. For me, this suggests that the Middle East has changed, hopefully for better. For me, this suggests that the Palestinian moderates have a backing and a model with whom they can work, because I think we all recognize the Middle East is at a crossroads. It can go in the direction that Iran is pushing through its proxies, a jihadist, extremist, violent future, maybe heading to a caliphate or whatever their vision is going to be. Or it can be a prosperous, enlightened beacon to the world, as it should be. And I think that what we can do now with the trauma of October 7th is realize, in terms of the Israeli side, that the assumption that we can manage the conflict in ways that Dr. Fayyad has described, that we can somehow move things forward, and this one-state reality, as you called it, is not sustainable. You cannot do that forever. And we're going to have to take advantage of this. So to wrap up my opening comments, I would say, how are we going to get there? And this is, I think, the most important thing that needs to be emphasized. I talk to people, I'm in a centrist party, I talk to people on the right and the left, but people on the right are far more open to a demilitarized Palestinian state than you can ever imagine. Nobody in Israel that I know, except for maybe a few very, very fanatical people on the far, far right, want to rule the Palestinians, oversee their lives, persecute them. They want security. Now, there is a good history in the world of post-conflict demilitarization. Japan was demilitarized between 1945 and 52 and then went on in the Treaty of San Francisco afterwards. Germany from 45 to 55, and indeed the Oslo agreements spoke about something very similar, talked about a police force for the Palestinian Authority and presumably for the state. And I would like to think that if we could move forward with that kind of an assumption, there is a place. And there are all kinds of complications. There are 500,000 Jews living in the West Bank, but there's 2 million Arabs living in Israel. I think these things are surmountable. I think what we need is political will on all sides and goodwill. So although, like many people, the last 6 months have been extremely challenging, I think there is a possibility, because there's really no other alternative, which makes life for me as an Israeli tolerable. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to explore a little bit two of the very big challenges to achieving a viable and full, that is recognized, two-state solution or reality that have surfaced already in the discussion. You can each comment on both of them, but one has to do with Hamas, its role in the future, and the problem and the existential fear for Israelis of continued insecurity or violence. The other has to do with the 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, which is the most frequently cited reason why people say it's a great idea, but how can a two-state solution be possible when it was so difficult to remove 8,000 Israelis, roughly that alone, from Gaza? How are you going to remove 500,000? So yesterday alone, when we were talking in Encina Hall, you used the word symmetry in terms of the dignity and statehood, the full dimensions of statehood that a Palestinian state must have. So let me ask you then two dimensions of the insecurity-security dilemma. Number one, what you see as the necessary and feasible role for Hamas going forward, and how that speaks to Israeli anxieties. And number two, if a full Palestinian state, recognized as such, admitted to the United Nations, and so on, were created, to what degree could Palestinians accept that in terms of conventional, not policing, military capacity, it could be a demilitarized state?
Thank you. I'll do that, but not before I comment briefly on what we heard in the nature of the course and all. You, Larry, said something about Israeli anxieties. We too have a lot of them as well, and that's what we understood. And I come to the table like someone who not only believes that everybody is entitled to their views, everybody is entitled to the truth as they see it. And I think that has to be respected if people are going to really, at some point, if they are going to be able to resolve conflict. So we agree that there needs to be a resolution. That's number one. Number two, how to get there. Good part of getting there requires that we address issues of symmetry in a serious way, which would require, actually, that we be looked at through the prism of how we see things having happened. You've heard from Alon, anxieties that Israelis had ever since Israel was established back in 1948, having to go to war, perceiving that it was living in this sea of rejection, born in sin, and all of that. But understand that very same year, 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed, and they're out as refugees. So there's a backdrop to Israel having been seen as born in sin that goes back to the way things happen, essentially. A fact that's recognized, I believe, in the essay that you alone circulated as reading material by Jabotinsky. If you read it, you will see that, as a matter of fact, that was recognized. Jabotinsky recognized it. And he actually said, among other things, it's foolhardy to think that Palestinians or Arabs of Palestine are going to be accepting of us. That was really part of thinking at the time. So there was that kind of anxiety. That's the genesis of all of this. Really, people had that experience, and it is deep as well. That's one. Secondly, the parallel that was drawn by Alon between Sadat, Egypt, withdrawal from Sinai, and what happened when Israel evacuated from Gaza or disengaged from Gaza in 2005. Two different things, and fundamentally two different processes in a fundamental sense. When Sadat did what he did, he was betting on for sure getting all of Sinai back, which was clear from the very beginning. It ended up being the outcome for sure, but for a small area, Taba that is, which through mediation and internationally and all ended up being decided to be part of Egypt, and that was all. So he knew all along that that was what the process was about, and it was not about 5 years or 10 years or anything like that. Everything was kind of really parameterized in a way that made that realistic, politically feasible and viable, even if he came under intense pressure. And he paid with his life eventually for it. We need to remember that. And so that is really the kind of backdrop. Conversely, in the case of Gaza, yes, Israel disengaged from Gaza in 2005, but it happened in a way that actually laid the seeds of separation, essentially, that we ended up doing it ourselves. A part of that disengagement, actually, in terms of design, the process, how it happened, and all, was a clear intent to make of Gaza a different Palestinian entity. Not necessarily separate, but a different Palestinian entity. Part of the design went into certain issues that I could relate to as an economist, as Minister of Finance and all, and it was not negotiated, was something that the Israeli side, working through the World Bank, conveyed their desire to have Gaza become or have a trade relationship with Israel in the nature of free trade area, when in fact both Gaza and West Bank under Oslo are part of one customs envelope, customs union area. And when I heard of this, my reaction was like, did they say anything about the West Bank? And the answer was no, this is about Gaza. If there's one thing that really actually defines, a couple of things that define political entities, particularly if we're talking about states, security on the one hand, and trade regime. You cannot have one country with different trade regimes with the world. So it seems to me that that's part of thinking. It didn't happen then, but unfortunately, we delivered. We Palestinians delivered a separate Gaza ourselves in 2007. So before we really can make progress, we need to understand kind of really missteps, and we need to do some introspection. There isn't really, basically the idea that we all have meant well and we wanted this and that to happen. I can tell you about our own national movement going back to the 20s of last century. It started against the backdrop of fear of immigration, Jewish immigration to Palestine. There was not much happened after Balfour Declaration in 1917, but 20 on with the immigration and all of that, people started to worry. And what was driving the movement at the time was not, oh, let's have a state of our own. Let's make sure Jews do not have a state. That's essentially what it was. And it took a very long time before the idea of Palestinian statehood being the objective national movement for that to really develop. There's a long history. I don't want to really get into this. But we must understand that there are grievances and all of that, and it's not going to really take us too far if we just look at one side of the truth that's accepted as the truth. There is another truth that should also be accepted as truth. At some point, there is a shared space within which people can operate and reach solutions. I think that's really important. Now, the anxiety has risen in Israel post-October 7. And what was perceived to be a problem with a segment of Israeli body politic prior to October 7 became a problem for majority of Israelis post-October 7, with the majority not wanting to hear anything about Palestinian statehood. And again, what is the two-state solution? It's about a Palestinian state emerging alongside the state of Israel. If that's not admissible in the discourse, there's a lot of work that needs to happen to really to get from here to there. And I think that requires some introspection, good deal of it, normalization, if you will, within Israel itself, before we talk about the rest of the Arab world and all of the rest of it. And certainly, for us Palestinians to also look and see what it is that we need to go to get to what we say is important to us, a state. How can we possibly get there when we have a divided house, when we have a divided polity, when we have something that is as challenging as a certain, a very serious rupture in our polity, and it has been there for many, many, many years now, with no sign of it really ending anytime soon. I think factional rivalries do a lot to explain the trajectory of our national movement and what happened. That rivalry was very, very destructive to our national cause. And we need to really find a way to actually manage that pluralism, not to eliminate it, not to exclude it. But I invite everyone to look at us like you look at any other people. You are here at Stanford Community. Somebody says the word pluralism. You say, hey, that's a good thing. This is about democracy. What is democracy? I mean, if pluralism is to be suppressed. Hamas is a political movement with an ideology. It happens to have significant following that rose steadily over time, particularly as more and more Palestinians realized that that state which they thought they were going to get as a result of having entered into the Oslo Accords was going to happen when more and more people started to realize it was not going to happen. So that bet which the PLO made at the time failed. And Hamas's support rose substantially because of that. Combined with the fact that the PLO, acting through the Palestinian Authority, did not always or uniformly rule well in accord with good governance and all of that sort of thing, any kind of opposition would gain political ground when something like this happens. So that's who they are, that's where they are, but they're a political movement. So when Israel early on, post-October 7th, said we're out there to totally destroy Hamas, eradicate Hamas, doing all of those kinds of things, I was thought to myself, how can anyone really declare that as an objective, adopt it as an objective, when anyone would tell you that as an idea, as a political ideology, you cannot destroy it. You can compete with it. You can offer people alternatives to choose from, but you cannot, kill an idea. You cannot destroy it. And now, more than 6 months into a most devastating war, the worst experience of our history, for sure, in terms of casualties, loss of life, death, destruction, despair, and all. When you really look at it now, it's not only from the point of view of Israel that a solution resumption of a peace process is difficult, given the anxieties. It is also as difficult on our side as well. So the question is, if at some point we need to really get there, in my book, we really need to begin by managing our pluralism more effectively than what we have been able to demonstrate for many years right now. It seems to me if there is a political faction, ideology, or thought in your society that at any point in time, post-2000 onward, they never polled anything less than 30-35% of public. To have a political system that is based on excluding, this significant political idea from a system is not going to produce stable outcomes or sustainable outcomes. So you need to manage that pluralism. That which is desirable and a good feature of societies that are managed well and all, it certainly applies to us as a people. Pluralism is better than dictatorial rule where everybody agrees on everything. That just doesn't happen. So the idea that somehow we need to audition for eligibility to engage in peace negotiations with Israel that could lead to Palestinian statehood, I think we just really need to move beyond that. And I think we should, as quickly as possible, do something to incorporate Hamas in the political system so they're not there at, kind of on their own, basically wanting to, again, go through this cycle, political cycle, of at once for decades the PLO, and then now we have Hamas, and then I don't know whom we're going to have next, and so on and so forth. So my suggestion at the time was, and this goes back many years, in fact, to 2014-13, was to bring Hamas into the fold of the PLO itself, whether as part of it or as part of something that's called Unified Leadership Framework, where they're part of this whole. And their job for a multi-year transitional period, not only Hamas, but everyone else around the table, is to consent to a Palestinian Authority government that can show up in Gaza immediately and begin to deal with the very difficult problems of getting started again and dealing with the catastrophe that Gaza has become and continues to unfold. That's the idea. So for this multi-year transitional period, there's going to be a government that is not factional government. It would run the show for a limited time period. That time period is bookended by elections. A date certain for which is announced at the outset of this transitional period. And then based on people's experience, they will get to choose their representatives and all, and see what happens afterwards. In terms of the parameters of state and all, in previous rounds of negotiations, security in particular, to the best of my knowledge, I was not directly involved in negotiations at any point in my career, except on matters that related to finance when I was finance minister, but not the political negotiations. But as best as I can ascertain, of the issues discussed and delineated for discussion as permanent status issues, security in particular was not difficult or contentious issue. There were several ideas, and the most recent round of negotiations that took place under the leadership from the United States of Secretary John Kerry, there's a plan or a vision for security that was developed by John Allen, who retired general at the time, U.S. general, and it was reasonable. It was not accepted readily by Israel, but it kind of provided the contours of what might be a workable arrangement for long-term security arrangements that could provide adequate assurances. So I don't think that's really, in particular, a showstopper. There are other issues, related, in particular, to the territory, and I close with this. Again, perception is better, and we heard kind of both sides of this in some way, and I really invite you to think about where people come to the table from. You heard from Alon what he said about how Israel came into being, and the rejection, that was met with and all. But at the same time, I would like for you to think about how enormous a shift in platform took place in 1988, when relative to our own truth, our own narrative, and I invite everybody to, when it comes to narratives and the people's truth, to kind of not engage in questioning them and maybe talk about issues like this, but then put those things aside. From the point of view, this issue is not going to be resolved by proving one narrative is superior to another. That's a non-starter. But taking that as a given, is there a possibility of a solution? And I think that's really a very reasonable way of going about it, and I think it can happen, and that's when we really get to this shared space, essentially. So we can get there, I believe. It's a question of understanding that's going to take a long period of time for people to get back on their feet, and the issue of perceptions again. So when that transformation took place in 1988, it was a major shift. A national movement saying, all of the land is ours, conversation that did take place in Israel in the making. If you go back to the deliberation, around the table, when it was decided by Israeli leadership, Jewish leadership at the time, not Israel, because Israel has not happened, whether or not Israel should go ahead and declare a state on the basis of the UN resolution, partition resolution. There was a huge debate around that table with opposition to the idea, because in their mind, all of the land must be theirs, and not only what Israel was going to be established on. The decider in this debate was Ben-Gurion at the time, who said famously, there is a difference between what people want and what they need. And what the Jewish people needed then at the time is a state. We have possibility for one, and I say we take it. That's what settled it. But they were having that conversation back in 1948. And Israel happened against the backdrop of that kind of debate. So that similar conversation took place on our side. And the shift was made formally in 1988, for sure. So it was not going back to the point Alon made about, Israel and Israelis are not sure whether, that state of Palestine is going to be on 6-7 borders as stage one of a more ambitious plan to take it all at some point. I can tell you definitively, and the record is there to support what I'm saying, the 1988 transformation in the PLO's platform is as real as it gets. Because in addition to the announcement made at the time by our late leader Yasser Arafat in front of everybody on live television, was accompanied by approval by the Palestine National Council, our parliament in exile, acceptance of UN Resolution 242. And UN Security Council Resolution 242 and 138, among other things, are about withdrawal from the territory Israel occupied in 1967, or territories Israel withdrew from, occupied in 1967. And that's as formal in acceptance of a state on 6-7, essentially the idea of a state, as you can get. They negotiated, PLO failed, and the bet they made it failed for a variety of reasons. But that's history. That's a profound shift in position. And it was real, but the process then failed. So they thought we do this, but we get a state, and we got nothing. And as early as 1995, I invite you, as students actually, to go and look it up yourself. Famous speech, given by late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in the Knesset, 1 month before he was assassinated. 1 month. And the Knesset convened at the time to hear him speak about Oslo Accords. He was seeking approval by the Knesset of the Oslo Accords with an S, plural, because it was the first part of Oslo and the second part that was agreed in Cairo. So everything. Whether it was his own position, whether it was something he felt he had to say to get the support he needed in Knesset for what he said, I had the answer to this question, but I'm going to say what it is. But regardless of why he said what he said, I invite you to analytically look at what he said in his own mind that Palestinian state was going to be, and compare it. This is an exercise I invite you to do. And compare it with the Trump peace plan of 2020. And you'll find close similarity to the point of congruence between what was said in 1995 and what Trump plan was in 2020. in two areas. One is territory, and the other one is sovereignty. There's no question in my mind, the two are pretty much the same when you actually compare the territory. And he himself said, basically, if this is a state, it's the equivalent of state minus, essentially. Talking about 70% of West Bank did not use the percentage, but by exclusion of Jordan Valley, by exclusion of areas where settlements are, you add the percentages up, they add up to about 30%. And when you look at actually what Trump's plan said about, for example, zoning, in which Israel would have overriding authority or purview inside the Palestinian state, in areas adjacent to the border without them defined, that clearly means that there was not going to be sovereignty under the Trump plan, and there was not going to be back in 1995. So we have these issues of perception to overcome. And we need to really have the process more calibrated, more parameterized, more defined. Doesn't matter how long it takes, but there needs to be clarity among other things that need to be taken into account. But all starts with, first of all, us putting our own house in order, investing in the effort that is absolutely needed to make the state happen. It is two-state solution. One thing that I invite people to think about, if we are to really have some traction to this going forward, is to answer, what does it really mean? We don't know what this Palestinian state is going to be like or anything like that. We say two-state solution. It means different things to different people. Donald Trump could describe his plan as two-state solution. But is it really acceptable? Is it viable? Not even Israel accepted it formally. I invite you to look for yourself footage, video of that massive ceremony at the White House, January 2020, when Bibi Netanyahu engaged in this incredible praise for how great Trump was, etc., etc. When it came to the operative part of speech, which was written, he said, Mr. President, Israel welcomes your plan, and we will negotiate with the Palestinians on the basis of your plan. He did not utter the words, we accept it. So this is really part of our reality. This is part of the sessions. We need to really deal with all of these issues. We need to be clear as to what it is. So I think we need to redefine it. If this is about two states, with one of the two states having been in existence for more than 3/4 of a century, it should be reframed to answer the following question. What does it take for there to be possibility for that other state to emerge alongside the State of Israel? And to begin to answer that question, reverse engineering. So it requires that we do this. Before anything else, it requires us Palestinians to invest really in that and to take it as a matter of highest order of responsibility, to assume full agency in the act of getting that state and its reality projected on the ground in spite of the occupation. That's what I feel is necessary. And that is what's capable of A, inspiring our own people, and B, maybe affecting the kind of transformation that I believe is necessary to happen on the Israeli side in order for there to be acceptance of that reality of a Palestinian state living side by side, State of Israel. Thank you.
Great. So, Alon, why don't you reflect on some of the issues that Salam Fayyad has raised here, and then we'll go to the audience.
Okay. So I'd like to map out for the students in the audience where I think we agree and where we might have some disagreements. I think we both agree that sometimes, particularly in the Middle East, the past is the enemy of the future. And that if we dwell on the various and sundry insults and injustices, and there are on both sides, we'll never get anywhere. The second thing we agree on is that we need to respect each other's narratives. I think this is something which I certainly have felt for many, many years, that the Palestinians have a perspective and they have the right to the perspective, and I'm not going to change that, and I don't want to change that. I accept it in the same way that I am very, very grateful that we have a senior Palestinian leader who accepts my narrative. The other thing which I think we agree on is that the only thing worse than 32 or 33,000 people dying in Gaza is 33,000 people dying in Gaza for nothing. This would be even an unacceptable, terrible, terrible tragedy. So I have a problem with the pluralistic vision which Dr. Fayyad advocates of integrating Hamas in whatever Palestinian leadership comes on. I understand the impulse, and it is a beautiful, idealistic one. But we remember what happened when that was an attempt in the past, and there were several attempts, and how many people in Fatah were thrown off the roof, and their knees were shot, and all the kind of violence, because, quite frankly, the Fatah vision for the future and its desire for a Palestinian state is not exactly the same as that of Hamas's. Hamas sees itself as part of the Muslim Brotherhood world and has another sort of Islamic vision to it. I also think when we look at history, we can see examples that after wars where certain perspectives were disqualified for a brief period of time. I can look at what happened with Konrad Adenauer was established the new state of Germany, and initially there was no room for Nazis in that discourse, okay? They decided that there was something evil there, and that was imposed to some extent by the winners of the war, that there are consequences when you start a military conflict. And quite frankly, this is just something that I've been feeling as of late, that if democracies can't finish wars that they didn't start when they were attacked, then democracies, at least in the Middle East, don't have a great future. So having said all that, what can we do to move forward in there? And I think there are things that we can do and that we must do. First of all, there are confidence-building measures on all sides. The government that I was part of up until 2022 made baby steps. I think we could have done much, much more. I hope we will. I myself, as an environmental guy, really envision an expansion of solar energy in Area C, which in fact we should probably end up canceling all the areas and give Palestinian energy autonomy. That would be a small thing. It would be good for the planet. It would be good for everybody. There's so many win-win things we could be doing in the environmental space, which we need to do because ecologically we're no bigger than a postage stamp and we really can't do it. In fact, 20 years ago, I don't know if you're friendly with Mohammed Al-Hamidi, the environmental professor. He was once the director of the Ministry of Environment in Palestine. We wrote a shadow environmental agreement that really said that we have to work together because we're so close together. There's going to have to be creativity. But there's also some things that I think will make it easier for Israelis to accept the sincerity of Palestinians moving forward. It bothers Israelis that there's $300 million in the Palestinian national budget which goes to essentially subsidize or compensate terrorist activity. That somebody who goes out and with the goal of killing Israelis ends up getting a financial bonus for it. That is galling. And I would also talk about the curriculum that is taught in the Palestinian Authority. In terms of what's going on in the last 17 years in Gaza, it's a travesty. Those kids, that generation that was raised on such vitriol and learning how to kill Jews from age 0, I hope that there's some redemption for them. But even in the Palestinian state, Congressman Brad Sherman from California just recently passed what he calls the Peace and Tolerance in Palestinian Education Act, which calls for Palestinians to show that their curriculum doesn't call for hatred in Israel, because certainly that isn't going to be something which bodes well for the future. So there are those kind of things which don't require any loss of autonomy. They just are expressions of goodwill. And I would like to think and hope that by creating a path forward, it's not going to happen today, like I said, but I think that over time, Israelis will realize that this is the only way forward. And we will realize that we once were terrible enemies with Egypt and with Jordan, and today we live in not only with peace, but we saw how they are cooperating with us in military things. So I think we can move forward, and I think we have a moral obligation to take advantage of this moment and not to make this yet another of the 5th or 6th round of violence with Gaza. This is something very different. It is the worst, I think, tragedy the Palestinians have faced in terms of casualties. It's the worst damage ever done to the Israeli, but let's realize that, okay, let's make sure this doesn't happen again, and that isn't going to happen by doing anything but looking for a better future. And the final thing I want to say is if we do want to have a better future, as I understand it, for now, I see no signs that Hamas is able to change its DNA. And they're going to have to be out of the room initially as we start to move forward, hopefully, to change the way we interact with each other and give our children a better hope for the future.
Can I ask a question on this very point, actually? If that's the judgment and determination that Hamas is not going to change its DNA, that's analysis, conclusion, fine. But how likely is it, do you think, that some members of the current Israeli government who are sitting cabinet officers, the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, how likely is it that politicians like those two and others whom they represent to change their DNA? In the words of one of them, and I'm not paraphrasing, quoting literally, we Palestinians have one of three choices to make. Either we acquiesce to what the power that Israel wants and all of that. Either we leave, or if we choose to resist, we get killed. I mean, these are the options we have. As I said before, I go back to what I said. There is a lot of introspection that needs to take place and looking in the mirror to really get to a point of normalization within our respective societies. And I actually think it would be really very important for the conversation to be approached from the point of view of understanding that when peace happens, when we at long last get to that point of convergence, I predict with certainty it will happen as naturally as it can get against the backdrop of something that I call parity. Parity. Not empathy, parity. You can't really approach this and thinking that you can achieve them. You heard from Alon, for example, a long list of expectations on our side to qualify. I haven't heard them say a thing about what kind of really changes need to occur in Israel's own behavior to make a solution
I
more
would
saleable.
like to
and
take.
so I'd like to, for that to really be starting a conversation. Let's really, again, my own suggestion is practical method. It's for us not to really move to one another now. This is not really the best of time to try to really get a deal on two-state or anything like that. There is time that is needed for transformation to get from point of impossibility now to a point of possibility. I happen to believe that that transformation is best aided by a fully determined Palestinian effort. Yeah, we are the weaker in this equation and this balance of power. But we are the ones, this is a Palestinian state that we're really talking about. If we Palestinians do not actually work very hard and invest heavily in assuming full agency in its creation, projecting its reality, who's going to do it for us? Yes, we need support. And if we can be enabled, that would be great. But it isn't unless we are fully determined to see it happen, that can happen, necessary to do, but it's also transformative.
I just want to give an answer to that briefly, and then we'll go to the students. And that is, when I was a member of parliament, whenever Ben Gvir, who is a very far-wing member of Israeli, racist, got up to speak, I walked out. As the Likud used to do for people with similar views, I think my party has a position that those extreme right-wing parties have no place in a ruling coalition, and I accept the parity that you suggest in that regard. I think extremists on both sides have hijacked our future for too long.
So, thank you. And now there are mics on both sides. Please line up, and we'll turn over to questions. I do want to report the results of the first poll. So 93% support a two-state solution, 7% do not. 55% think it's possible, and 45% think it's not. So that's the initial polling. Support, but not very likely. And we'll see at the end where at 4:45 I'll take another poll. So let's start with the questions.
Hi. Sorry, hello. I just wanted to say, firstly, thank you guys. I think it was very important to have both perspectives. I think that's something that at least at the university has been a little bit lacking. I appreciate just both of you guys coming here and giving both a historical and your own commentary, perspectives on it. One thing I didn't appreciate though, I voted personally at the beginning that I don't think a two-state solution is possible, and I don't think, I said no to both. I forget what the second question was, but I said no to both. I wanted to just say, given how I didn't agree completely with both of you guys, I know there were a couple of things that you guys brought up about a one-state solution not being possible. Some things like normalization. I know, Alon, you brought up the example of Japan being demilitarized, and I didn't really appreciate that because given the history of Japan, it's also a country that was completely destroyed after World War II. And so in order to get to that point where they could integrate back in global culture, they needed to have a third body like the US that kind of directed, although I don't know, there was always conversations about how well they did it, but to direct the integration of culture and education. And one thing I appreciate that both of you guys spoke about was that cultural integration is something being done in both countries, both in Palestine and in Israel. That's very important to the Israeli cause. And I wanted to, one thing that Salam, you had said was there was conversation about the land being ours, all the land is ours. And in order for that to be I guess, moving forward in a one-state solution, if you could humor me, I wanted to ask if it were possible to have a one-state solution, what would the name have to be for that country?
You answer the question at a time, or how do you?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. Well, some tried their hands with that before, combination of Israel and Palestine, but a little bit of the historical backdrop to the name. During those deliberations leading to the proclamation of statehood by Israel, of Israel, and I distinguish between establishment of the state and proclamation of statehood, because in my opinion, institutions of the state were put together, some of them anyway, before the state was proclaimed. And so there was this question of what do we call it? And some decided, well, maybe we should call it Palestine. This is true. But in the end, it was decided against it because there were some, at least, who believed this was taking place against the backdrop of partition plan, which provided for a Jewish state and an Arab state on that land which we consider ours, ancestral land, and Jews call land of Israel. Eretz Israel, land of Israel. So they said Palestine, and then some thought, well, no, maybe we shouldn't say Palestine, we should say something else, Israel, because at some point maybe this other state will happen, and they most likely are going to call it Palestine. So let's just stay away from it. An interesting question. It's not because I don't think that is something people should not think about in terms of a possible solution. I told you at the outset, I'm not here to say what the solution is going to be. Solution is not anywhere near what I can think is something that I personally will see in my lifetime. I'm afraid. I'm being realistic about this. It's not to say that nothing should or can be done to make a solution still possible. I think that's the duty of who remains of us, to make sure that that pathway is there for a solution. It may very well be, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, people think that, well and good, things have changed so much. One state is the answer to the aspirations of everybody. Jabotinsky, spoke about things like that. You'd be surprised, but that is reality. So, but talking about two different nations, two different people, consider. So that could happen. I'm not really saying, impossible, don't think about it, it's a ridiculous idea. All I'm really saying, period, is the following. To say that two states is difficult has not happened is dead, and think that, therefore, one state solution is automatically attainable is a mistake. Because that lulls us into believing that we're really headed toward the solution if we do nothing. And if we do nothing, you see what happens. You know what I'm saying? So I think we really should work on something. It's up to future generations to decide. And if it is two-state, it's up to them to decide the contours of the possible and agreeable, including on settlement activity. The process itself was so fluid, the Oslo process, including on the issue that Larry, as he pointed out, one of the most contentious issues, that when people really point to why two states are impossible to be the answer to this problem, is settlements. And people look at the growth of settlements and settler population and say it's Oslo that did all of this. Actually, it's not Oslo per se that did all of this. What did it was prematurely signaling on the part of Palestinian leadership of willingness to swap territory with Israel. And when that happened, all of a sudden settling in what is now the West Bank, actually, not Gaza, became a one-way bet for settlers. Not everybody, not every settler is there for ideological reasons. So when they realized that this is a one-way bet, matter of convenience, all of a sudden the settler population increased dramatically to the point where people say the solution concept is dead under the heavy weight of settlement expansion. But that has to be resolved if there's going to be a two-state solution. And it can be, I agree, it can be resolved. There are ideas, and I think those ideas are best deliberated by those who are going to be around the table to agree on them when the solution becomes possible.
We need to move to the next question.
Dr. Fayyad, Dr. Tal, thank you so much for being here and having this difficult conversation. My question is for Dr. Tal. Dr. Tal, considering the international consensus increasingly viewing Israel's action in Gaza as genocidal, with the brutal killing of more than 35,000 innocent civilians, mostly children and women, 80% of Gaza's infrastructure being destroyed, reports of rapes, targeted killings of aid workers, and enforced starvation, all directly orchestrated under Mr. Netanyahu's government, how can there be any hesitation to arrest him for these monstrous war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the gravest violations of international law?
I reject categorically the assumptions behind that question. Let's think about what it means to conduct a war in an urban space. Did you know that in World War II, 2 million Japanese civilians died, okay, so that the United States could resolve that thing? Now, did the United States commit genocide? I don't think so. I think they were defending their sovereignty. Same is true in Afghanistan, all kinds of places. If you talk to people who actually are military experts, the efforts that Israel's gone to fight in crowded urban areas has been extraordinary. Mistakes have been made, horrible tragedies, but let's remember who started this war. We didn't want this war. And so to claim that when you're genocidal, your intention is to wipe a nation off the map. Believe me, Israel could have done that much, much easier had it desired. I have friends, political colleagues, whose children died because they did not want to harm civilians. They went into buildings knowing that there would be Hamas fighters there rather than calling in Apache to take it out, okay? And that has been a critical part of the Israeli thing. If Israel wanted to commit genocide, why do we ask everybody to leave? We begged the Palestinians in Gaza City, leave so that you won't be harmed. So that allegation, to me, is invalid and legally, but it's also just wrong morally. Do you really think that any country that is attacked the way we were attacked would sit back and say, well, there might be collateral damage, so we're just going to let it go? Like I said earlier, if that's the future for democracies, then we don't have a future certainly not in the Middle East, which is a pretty tough neighborhood. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, if I may comment on this, I agree with what Alon said about Japan, other countries in Europe, and including the winning side of that war, Second World War that we talked about. But I think it's worthwhile remembering that a lot of the codification of rules of war happened afterwards, precisely because of the war crimes that were committed and the casualties and the very high toll in human life and suffering as a consequence of that war, including the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide that was promulgated late 1948, came into force in 1951, well after the war. The Geneva Conventions, for Geneva Convention, and how you treat and deal with civilians under war and all of that sort of thing. And those things were codified not without reason, not against the backdrop of nothing. Israel itself was signatory to that Genocide Convention. I think it's important to note. Now, I think it's a fair question to ask is what's happening, genocide or not. In my humble opinion, it was up until the International Court of Justice accepted to take the case that was filed by South Africa. It's a specialized international organ to look into these issues. And the court, by an overwhelming majority, resolved that there was preponderance of evidence in favor of accepting the case, not ruling on it, but taking it. That's being adjudicated. That's being looked at. And let's see what the outcome is. I just leave it to the specialized body to rule on this. So, in a rules-based system, this is the way it ought to be, I think. That's number one. Two, regardless of where the deliberations go or don't go, two additional points I need to make. First of all, not you, but what Israel announces as objectives of policy, goals that are clearly impossible to attain, destruction of Hamas, elimination of Hamas, or in best of circumstances, very difficult to attain, as a war that lasted more than 6 months now has demonstrated, dislodging Hamas from government in Gaza. To this day, there are all kinds of signs that are suggestive of Hamas still in control governance-wise of Gaza. So how many more tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians need to be killed before you come to the realization this is to no end, to use your own language. This is to no end relative to the objective that was set forward. The second point on this is technical. Regardless of how the ICJ rules on this, there's no question that war crimes have been committed. I mean, just observing and reading and looking at it, genocide is a technical determination. Finding of genocide requires, finding that someone, a state, committed one of 5 different crimes with intent to destroy in whole or in part a group nationally, ethnically, racially, or religiously, something like that. That's technical. But war crimes are war crimes, and they include, among other things, putting civilians knowingly in harm's way. This can be even less than targeting them and all of that sort of thing. And I think in a lot of what we see, there is a lot that definitely falls under that category. So with the debate going on, what we call it and all of that, there continues to be a lot that's committed against the pursuit of an objective that is impossible to attain. And finally, I think when this war comes to an end, and I hope sooner rather than later in the interest of everyone, including, for the sake of at some point, getting this whole process on the track of resolution on a sustainable basis, I think there ought to be accountability. Any and all acts that involve putting civilians in harm's way knowingly, any and all acts, regardless of who committed them, must be brought to justice. And there has to be accountability. And as Palestinian, I stand here before you to say, if I had anything to do with it, we Palestinians, before anyone, should fully cooperate with an independent commission of inquiry in terms of what happened on October 7 itself, and fully cooperate in the sense of handing over and dealing with whatever it is we're required to do in accordance with the findings of an independent international commission of inquiry. And that ought to look at what happened on October 7, in addition to everything that has happened since then and sadly continues to happen today.
Do you want to say something briefly, or should I move to the...
I would just say that I don't know how many of you have combat experience. I fought in the first Lebanon War as a soldier for the Israeli army. Wars are horrible, horrible things. Terrible things happen. I agree with Dr. Fayyad that there are cases where there's definitely intent and there are war crimes. But 200,000 Iraqis died when the United States attacked. Would anybody question whether the war crimes were committed? Of course, bad things happen there. I just find it interesting that Israel is always singled out for its activities, despite the efforts, sending phone messages and dropping leaflets and trying very hard to avoid it. But I think that for a family that lost a child, it doesn't really matter what your explanation is. The goal has to be to find a way so these kind of wars never happen again.
So we should move to the next question. I will put in a plug. There's a great course at Stanford on the rules of war, taught by Scott Sagan and Alan Weiner, and I recommend it. But to the next question.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be in a room where we can have these difficult conversations, and I'm appreciative to all of you. My question, I think, speaking to the point about whether Israel's war against Hamas is useful or effective, my question is, how effective are the strategies of jihad, intifada, and martyrdom in achieving the stated objectives? And what I mean by that is, if we're talking about a population of people who founded the State of Israel who are traumatized by extremes of violence, and then you're subjecting them to, again, violence, how effective are those strategies likely to be in getting those people to submit? I guess it's sort of a general question. And sorry, then the other qualifier is that I hear those strategies being described in some circles as armed resistance and in others as terrorism, and I'd love to get some understanding from your perspective of how you view them.
I would think that Dr. Fayad has more to say on the question of strategy in the Palestinian side.
Our purview, right?
Yeah, but I would say this, that I appreciate the question because the way you framed it, and I should have opened with this, and that's because you said Israel's war against Hamas, and that's what it is. This is not a war against the Palestinian people. Israel has 2 million Palestinian Israeli citizens. There are complaints, but they have rights, and many, many close friends. There's no intent. Hamas is something entirely different, and I think that their strategies have backfired from the Palestinians' perspective, but I'm not a person to judge. I would rather hear his answer.
There are two dimensions to this that I can think of. One is, I think, more or closer to your point about how effective you said, question of viability. And there is a question of principle. I make a distinction between the two. If we talk about resistance of all kinds in contexts where a population, a people, are subjected to an oppressive occupation, is a right. I'm not really questioning the principle, it should not really be questioned. Then it becomes, the second order question is like, what is really our best way to resist? And we have in our history examples of everything, and how it worked, how it didn't work, and examples of maybe some illustration of how best to really go about it going forward. Because there's no question, in terms of the principle of it, we're duty-bound to resist because we're normal. We have been subjected to a highly oppressive occupation, highly capricious, living under highly capricious occupation regime for many, many decades now. And it's only natural for us to want to resist that. I think that has to really be another perspective. The question is, how do you go about it? I'm not here to deny the right of anyone that is subject to oppression to resist in the way they know how to do it best, and how within what is defined as rightful behavior. And resistance is right. Now, how to go about it? I myself stand for nonviolent resistance, not only because I believe it's more viable, but on grounds of principle. I think personally, this is my own personal view, that nonviolence is inherently a very strong and powerful means of resistance. And it has many manifestations, some associated with demonstrations, marches, protests, things like these are forms of it. But there is another form of it that's really actually a lot closer to the nature of what I perceive to be the most important task ahead of us. It was always ahead of us. Unfortunately, we didn't always kind of approach it this way. The highest form of resistance in the face of a colonial occupation that is really about the land, about land grab, if you really look at the settlement enterprise of the State of Israel and the designs and all of that sort of thing, is to ensure that we do everything humanly possible to make it possible for people to exist. To exist is to resist, and that means that you have to provide for their welfare, their capacity to survive, to endure, to be able to send their kids to school, to have healthcare facilities, to have all of that. And given that a state is what we're looking for, to do that in the context of an exercise that is aimed chiefly at projecting the reality of the state on the ground. That's the highest form of resistance in my book. It's not only more viable, I stand for it on grounds of principle. But I'm not here to say that if others think otherwise, that other forms of resistance are more viable or better. I'm not going to say on grounds of principle you are disallowed from this conversation. I think it's really up to us to really think about these issues and decide collectively, and not leave it up to X, Y, or Z, or somebody really on a trip of some sort to decide, oh, let's go to war now. Let's really have that kind of conversation. And I think the closer we will get to the point of engaging in that kind of act of empowerment that I'm describing to you, that I think you'll find a lot of people investing in this and affiliating them with this and beginning to see signs of and fruits of success associated with that kind of resistance. We fell short along the way. There were some episodes of marvelous forms of resistance going back to the first Intifada that lasted for a number of years. And in fact, I argue that on the strength of that 1987 Intifada, generally viewed as non-violent and all of that, on the strength of that, that it was possible for our leadership to accept 1988 or to make the transition in 1988. So these things can be powerful, that can be highly inspiring. But right now, the state is what we want. Let's go out and build it. And that to me is the highest form of resistance. That's me speaking, yeah.
Thank you.
We should move to the next question. I see we have lines, and we probably will not, in fact, I know we won't be able to get through all the questions, but let's see how many we can get through.
Thank you all so much for being here. I think it takes a lot of courage in the context of the conflict, but also in terms of what's been happening on U.S. university campuses recently. I also want to say that I'm approaching this with humility and curiosity, given I don't know much about this conflict, apart from that it's caused a lot of suffering over many generations. To me, it seems that a two-state solution, given the current context, is further than ever. And so I wanted to ask Dr. Fayyad, and also perhaps Professor Diamond, if there already is a sort of de facto one-state solution, can you envision any power-sharing arrangements or any institutions that could be set up to promote peace, similar to how the Dayton Accords operated in former Yugoslavia, or the Good Friday Agreement brought peace to Northern Ireland?
I am not sure. First of all, you said something about what exists looking more or less like a one-state solution. As I described it before, it's more of a reality than a solution. I personally do not think it is likely, nothing is impossible, I guess, but it's not likely that there will come a point in time when there is agreement on power sharing that is not ultimately based on right of representation, with people having the ability to be included and the certainty of fully participatory democracy in a consolidated way, eventually. So that is the model. That's what one-state solution means. A consolidated state with democratic processes where people are included, equal rights and obligations under the law. Doesn't really matter what their ethnic background, their faith background is. That's what a solution should look like, if it is a one-state solution. I personally don't see it as a possible way out of this, and it is not too surprising to me that for a long period of time, now coming up on, maybe in 90 years, since the idea was basically tossed around for the first time about partitioning land being, because there are models like this. There are states that came into being after being like one state. They became two states. Czech Republic is an example of that. Former Czechoslovakia, for example, amicably, they separated. For a long time, this was viewed by many in Israel as a solution, but not precisely in a way that fits or meets our expectation. I'm still in the space that maybe some work on this and seriousness in pursuing that goal could produce an outcome that is acceptable to both sides, but I just don't see this happening anytime soon. That's the thing.
We should move to the next question.
So when people from Gaza tried nonviolent protests during the Great March of Return in 2018 to 19, 223 marchers were killed, and nothing changed. No progress on the right to return for 70% of people in Gaza expelled from 48 Palestine. What solution is there other than armed resistance to achieve the principles of Thawabit? When 80% of freedom fighters are orphans, how can we not see armed resistance as the reality? And also, since Japan was mentioned, I also want to mention that during the Japanese occupation of much of Asia, people justify resistance against Imperial Japan, and those who collaborated with Japan were considered traitors. While we consider Asian resistance against Japanese occupation to be resistance, why do we make an exception by calling Palestinian resistance terrorism?
I believe there is a difference between targeting civilians and targeting soldiers. Israel has been the target, Israeli civilian homes, offices, stores, whatever you want to call it. 10,000 rockets have come in. I think that is fundamentally different than when a military base is attacked. Okay, I don't think that's international law says that. Now, I understand that people, Palestinian people, would like to return to their homes of 1948. But to me, that ship has sailed. The history of the world is filled with conflicts where there was population exchanges, and the implications of that is that we want to come back, and after trying to kill you through military means, now we want to try to beat you demographically, and I don't think that's anything that Israelis are inclined to do. So I started by saying that is exactly the 1948 perspective that you said, which makes Israelis so skeptical about any negotiated settlement. I would like to believe that in the context of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we could actually overcome our historic grievances. But if you want to continue the war for another 2 or 3 generations, Israel is able to do that. I just think it'll be yet extending the tragedy, and I would hope we could do better than your very limited vision.
So I'm going to ask that the poll be put up, poll questions again, and I think we can take one more question while we put up the poll questions.
Awesome. I want to thank you for your time. I want to acknowledge the difficulty of war. My grandfather fought in the Korean War, a war that we don't talk about, but we live in the realities of the outcome of that war. And my father fought in Iraq. Unfortunately, he's no longer living due to the outcomes of that war and the soldiers. Vietnam War is a terrible example to use as an excuse for anything, as the U.S. has admitted to its wrongs, including things like Agent Orange, which are still affecting the civilian populations to this day. But my question is, as a future leader, all of us in this room are future leaders, whether it's business or government. How should we think about doing business in or with any country that blocks humanitarian aid, such as food, water, from starving populations that are struggling, from the civilians that are struggling to find food, water, those types of things?
You know, on April 13th, there was a massive attack of Iranian rockets to Israel. One of the good things that happened that night was that 68 trucks of humanitarian aid came into Gaza from Israel without being commandeered by the Hamas. I believe that it's a moral obligation to ensure the steady food supply, sanitation to the extent possible in times of war. Israel has made efforts in that respect, which I think are significant. There may have been mistakes made in that regard, but as a policy, I do not believe, if Israel had wanted to starve out the people of Gaza, they would have, and that would have been a great moral blemish on us, and I'm glad we did not.
A lot was said about the United States, by the way. I meant to comment on earlier part of what was said in terms of the world didn't really stop too much to think about what the U.S. itself did in war, whether World War II or here or there. I don't think that's really necessarily is a standard that we should kind of really accept as a norm in some way. If it was wrong then, it's wrong today. If it's wrong today, it was wrong then. The fact that the United States did it does not make it right. It actually, there are many lessons that should have been learned from that whole experience, and they were. And that's why, you know, those codes were put in place, and that's why those agreements were pursued. In terms of what the U.S. is trying to do right now, my own sense is that they've been wishing for this war to stop some time ago, and they're still in that space. That's my perception. There's a question as to whether or not they're doing enough. I don't think they are. I mean, there is a difference between what they wish to see happen and what they're doing about it, including in the area of humanitarian provision, of humanitarian aid and support. It was not until a fairly difficult phone call that President Biden had with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as reported reliably, that all of a sudden it became possible to really deal with some of the mistakes that were happening. I think it is not unreasonable to consider part of the delays, at least in part, that were reflective of policy. Why am I saying this? I'm not making this up. There are some Israeli officials, sitting cabinet officers, who said, use the words, we're going to starve them to death. We're going to cut them off from water, electricity, and everything. We're going to level off Gaza. And by the way, that's part of the argumentation that was made before the ICJ when it decided to accept the case or to look into the case filed by South Africa. Those statements being suggestive of intent. Now, did that really reflect a state of mind that was driven by revenge and or? That's a consideration. But when things last beyond, the initial phase of it, the initial shock of it, and last on for weeks and months and months and months, and all of a sudden now we're talking about like Israel, we have to go into Rafah because we have destroyed everything. All we have to do is to get into Rafah. What kind of evidence does anyone have that Israel has actually attained the military objectives they really say they have attained? I personally am not persuaded. To this day, actually, even a few days ago, some rockets were launched into Israel from northern Gaza. That's northern Gaza. That was supposed to be totally under control. My own submission with respect to war, this is a war to no end relative to the objectives set forward by Israel. The war is not really going to change the trajectory of politics as is desired or as so true. Some people are wishing that Hamas is going to really become weaker as a consequence of the war. That may have happened to some extent. I don't think it is going to be the outcome when all is said and done. The only thing that really can change this reality for the better for everybody is for there to be an immediate effort and serious one made at stopping a war that has become a war with no end in sight, because there's no attainable objective relative to the objectives actually put forth by the state of Israel. That's important. A lot more work needs to be done. Not only on, the idea that, okay, go ahead and do what you need to do, and the important thing is to, provide humanitarian aid and support. This is, I even dare say, cynical. Something as bad as what has been going on in terms of death, destruction, and war, again, to no end, that is the fundamental cause of what's going on. And an end has to be brought to this as soon as possible.
I would just like to agree that it seems to me that if Israel really wants to defeat Hamas, the only real way to do that is to bring in an alternative government which can provide a better future for the Palestinians. I'd also like to add that this war would have been over a long time ago if we could have had the hostages relieved, and I haven't perhaps emphasized that as much as I should have, how important it is. The 230 Israeli innocent civilians, for the most part, were taken out and have been held under the most horrendous of conditions, never allowed to meet with the Red Cross, never a sign of life except very sporadically in a manipulative way. And I would hope the next day or two will be critical because there's an issue. They're only talking about 33, but that may be all that's left that are alive, that we could find a way to release the hostages and start talking about a saner future for Gaza. And the last thing I want to say, I once read an article about water in the Middle East called Thirsting for Pragmatism. It is a pleasure to speak with Dr. Salam, who is such a voice of pragmatism. For years now, that was his whole trademark as prime minister. And I look forward to his spirit leading the Palestinian side as we move forward to a better future.
So we're out of time, I'm afraid, for other questions. The Stanford Political Union Student Group is outside, hoping to get students for a post-class discussion, and we invite you to join them. I think this has been a remarkable event, really remarkable. I've been sitting up here almost weeping with just the hope of serious, very hard conversation on one of the most difficult issues right now of our time, and the way that the disagreement has been handled, the student questions. I want to invite you to join me in thanking our guests, our moderator, for really a phenomenal modeling of what universities are about and what gives us hope for a better future. So thank you.
Thank you.